Here we are in the little northeast English town of Trimden. This very unassuming building that we see here is a carpet shop nowadays. However, in the past, French Prime Minister Lionel Jospin would drink a pint of beer here. Some guy named Clinton called there asking for some guy named Tony, and that same Tony would announce that he was stepping down as British Prime Minister in 2007 at this very same place. However, for Tony Blair, it would be this building that would launch not only his political career, but the road to becoming one of the most important figures to transform the Labour Party. In 1983, Blair came to this building, which was owned by the Labour Constituency Association in Sedgefield. There he met with John Burton, the secretary of the association. Hearing that Sedgefield, a newly created constituency, hadn't selected a candidate for the 1983 general election, Blair convinced Burton and the association to select him as their candidate. And from there, we can say the rest is history. Hello, welcome to Election History. My name is Dave and I make videos about the history of campaigns, elections, political parties, candidates, and the like. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe to my channel and check out some of the other videos after watching this one. This is a brief video about the rise of the Labour Party in the late 20th century, which eventually led to Tony Blair's landslide election in 1997. But to understand how we got to this place, we have to go back 17 years to 1980 and look at the divisions that almost destroyed the Labour Party, from which it had to rebuild. In 1979, the Labour Party suffered a massive defeat to Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party. While there are numerous reasons for Labour's defeat, the focus was on what was to be known as the Winter of Discontent that was front and center. Throughout Britain, thousands of workers in both the public and private sectors went on strike demanding pay raises. There were calls from the public as well as other political parties for the Labour government of James Callaghan to intervene in resolving these strikes. However, the far left within the Labour Party, many of them being part of the Trotskyite militant group, demanded that the government stop interfering in any union negotiations. A motion was passed in the Labour Party conference by nearly 2-1 demanding the end of any negotiations. This lack of involvement meant that workers were on the picket lines, which further exacerbated the inflation problems that Britain had been facing over the last 2 years. Labour would go on to lose in a landslide in the 1979 general election, which triggered a leadership race within Labour. The Labour leadership race in 1980 really brought to light the problems that the Labour Party had. There were a number of ideologically pure factions within the party which sought to make their ideologies prominent even at the expense of losing elections. The person who was assumed to be the next Labour leader by most was Denis Healey. In fact, many in Britain thought that Healey would be a better prime minister over Thatcher. Healey was a pro-European centralist in the party that expected to win both the centre and the right in the party leadership contest. Many on the left were opposed to his candidacy and pushed to have Tony Benn, a far-left politician, for the leadership of the Labour Party. While many on the left supported the ideas of Benn, many also saw Benn as too tribal and rigid in his political ideology. Still, the party wanted to find a leader that wasn't tribal, still part of the left, but had the ability to work with the center and right within the party as well. This led to the party, or more accurately, the Labour members of Parliament, pushing for Michael Foot to run for leadership. The first round of the Labour Party leadership race took place on November 4th, 1980, with Denis Healey finishing first place with 42% of MPs and Michael Foot finishing with 31%. The other two contenders, John Silken and Peter Shore, were eliminated. This led to the second round being between Healey and Foot. The second round, which was to take place 6 days later, saw Foot win 51.9% of the vote to Healey's 48.1% of the vote. So, how did the hands-on favorite to win the leadership end up losing? First, many MPs thought that Healey simply assumed that he would have the support of the right and moderates in the party, even going to the point of speaking to them quite in a derogatory way. However, and possibly the main reason Foot won, was because of the Gang of Four. There were 4 Labour MPs who, less than 2 months later, would form their own political party called the Social Democratic Party. They opposed the militant group who they felt had taken over the Labour Party and decided to split. Knowing that they were going to make this political move, political scientists Ivor Crew and Anthony King, who you might have seen during the 1980s and 1990s BBC coverage of election night, wrote in their book about the SDP that these members voted for Foot because they wanted Labour to have the most unelectable leader to lead the party after these four split from Labour. If all four had voted for Healy, that would have still been a win for Foot by 2 votes. However, there were eventually 12 Labour MPs that would make the switch over to the SDP. Did this make the difference? Possibly, but many argue that Labour just wanted a non combative leader heading into the next election. During Foot's time as leader, the factional divisions within the party continued. Healy, who was actually elected deputy leader in 1980, almost lost that position to Tony Benn in 1981. Also, in the early 1980s, Militant continued to play a large role in Labour politics, especially in city centres, particularly in Liverpool. And Foot, while being seen as a non-tribal compromiser, was still of the left, with many in Britain considering him too far left. With the 1983 general election quickly approaching, polls were showing that Labour could possibly finish third behind Thatcher's Conservatives and the alliance that was formed with the Liberal Party and the Social Democrats, who had just been Labour MPs just a few years earlier. The way that Labour decided to tackle this issue was to, well, move further to the left. While the Conservatives were talking about economic growth, unemployment, and defense, especially after the successful Falkland Islands War, Labour was talking about nuclear disarmament, abolishing the House of Lords, leaving the European Economic Community, and state control of certain industries. Essentially, it was completely out of touch with what most voters wanted to talk about and showed that the party, even under Michael Foot, was still beholden to the far left when it came to its manifesto. Gerald Kaufman, a Labour MP who was a centrist within the party, called the Labour manifesto, quote, the longest suicide note in history. On election night, Labour would lose 9.3% of their total compared to the last election, narrowly defeating Alliance by 2.2%, while trailing the Tories by nearly 15%. Labour would go on to lose 60 seats, but even with these losses, 3 of Labour's new candidates ended up winning, which were Jeremy Corbyn, Gordon Brown, and Tony Blair. The alliance saw first-time victories for Patty Ashdown and Charles Kennedy, future leaders of the Liberal Democrats, as well as Michael Howard, future leader of the Conservative Party. After the election, Michael Foot stepped down as Labour Party leader. There had been speculation that Neil Kinnock, Shadow Secretary of State for Education, would be the leading contender, especially after much of the union support lined up behind Kinnock. Still, this election was different than the 1980 leadership race in 2 major ways. First, the election of leader wasn't based purely on MPs alone, but a combination of unions affiliated with the Labour Party, which accounted for 40% of the vote, the Labour Party constituency organization vote, with 1 vote for each organization, which comprised of 30% of the vote, and the current Labour members of Parliament, which was also 30% of the vote. The second major change was that many ideological purists on the far left of the Labour Party lost their seats in Parliament, such as Tony Benn. This led to less ideological divisions and tribalisms within the leadership election than had been seen in the past. Neil Kinnock would easily go on to win 71.3% of the vote, with Roy Hattersley being elected as deputy leader. Neil Kinnock wanted to focus on rebranding the party. You might have noticed that I said rebranding instead of rebuilding, and that's because the party thought that Labour had more of an image problem than anything. It was old, its former leader was old, the ideas of the party came from old socialist books that were written by men who had been dead for decades. With that, there were 2 primary areas of focus when it came to rebranding. The first area of focus was to have an ideological rebranding. Kinnock himself didn't want the party to abandon the left, but he also didn't want voters to see the party as not aligning with their views. The main problem that Labour had was the influence of the far left in the party, which was labeled as the loony left. The next year, in 1984, Tony Benn found himself back in Parliament by winning a by-election in Chesterfield, but he was pretty marginalized by this time. But the militant group still had influence within far left organizations and pushed to continue to be an influence in labor politics. They were also in control of the Liverpool City Council and had local support in and around Liverpool. They continued to become a stronger influence in the party, and it looked like a takeover by the far left was possible. But then came the 1985 party conference. During his speech, Neil Kinnock explained that winning elections needed to be the focal point of the Labour Party.
We want to honour our undertakings in full, in every sphere, every area of policy. We want to say what we mean and mean what we say. We want to keep our promises. And because we want to do that, it is essential that we don't make false promises. That precondition is unavoidable, total, insurmountable, and it's a precondition, and in this movement we don't want to surmount. It is the precondition that we win a general election. That is the precondition.
He also continued to talk about how ideological purism was not practical, saying,
"Implausible promises don't win victories. I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises. You start with far-fetched resolutions. They're then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code. And you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs, and you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour Council hiring taxis to scuttle around the city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers." I'm telling you, you can't play politics with people's jobs and with people's services.
While this conference didn't mean the end of militant, as the conflict between them and Kinnock would continue for another few years, this speech wasn't for them, but for the general public, showing the average voter that the later leadership was no longer beholden to the militant and far left in the party. One could say that this could have been Labour's first Sister Soldier moment, a video that I have for my members only section of the channel, so you can check it out if you're a member over there. Still, even though he presented this, the militants continue to have enough of a profile to make it look as if the militants and Labour Party were connected at the hip, and the Conservatives wanted to make it look that way as well. Also, as I said earlier, Kinnock was part of the left and still a supporter of things like nuclear disarmament, which a large part of the public opposed. Yes, this was a step in the right direction to meet the voters where they were, but it still was only the first steps. The second part of the rebranding process was to make the party more media friendly. One of those that was brought on to do this job was Peter Mandelson. Mandelson came from a strong Labour family, with his grandfather serving under a number of roles in the House of Commons, as well as minister in a few positions. After studying at Oxford, Peter was elected to the Lambeth Borough Council, but didn't run for re-election. He eventually ventured into media, and between 1982 and 1985 was a producer at Weekend World, a political television series. Mandelson eventually was hired by the Labour Party in 1985 as communications director to change the image of the party. His goal wasn't necessarily political, but more on the media side of things. He wanted to revamp the party's image from an old, drab collection of aging socialists to a new vision for a modern Britain. One of the first things that Mandelson did was change the party's logo from a flag to a rose. The old flag logo, Mandelson argued, looked too much like a flag from a communist country. And with the mid-1980s being the height of the Cold War, it wasn't necessarily an image that could help win votes. This is when the Labour logo changed to the rose, a logo that is still used in some fashion today. Another thing that Mandelson wanted to do was promote younger voices that had more personality and that could connect more easily with the public in general. This is where Mandelson discovered two members of parliament who had been sharing the same office, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who he booked to appear on television as often as possible. More about them later, but from this point forward, Mandelson, Brown, and Blair would work tirelessly to bring about what would eventually be called New Labor. Of course, this rebranding was to prepare for the 1987 election, which was to be a tall order. While Labor was moving in the right direction, it only started doing so. The far left in the party was still vocal. This gave conservatives, especially those at The Sun, a Rupert Murdoch run tabloid, as calling it a newspaper would be a great insult to newspapers, more ammunition to attack Labor. They would go as far as comparing the Labor Party to Stalin. Still, the Labor Party had changed, and some of the polls a few months out from the election show that it could be a hung parliament. But another problem that Labor had, which was one of the problems that they had in 1983, was the alliance. In 1983, both were fighting to be second place to the Conservatives. In this election, Labor wanted to clearly show that they were still a fighting force in politics and that they were the only ones who could truly take on Margaret Thatcher and the Tories. On June 11, 1987, Labor gained 3.2% of the vote from their 1983 total, as well as picking up 20 seats. While not a huge shift, it was a positive shift nonetheless. This was also the last breath for the far left in Labor politics. In 1988, at the Labor Party conference, Neil Kinnock was challenged by Tony Benn for the party's leadership. Kinnock would go on to easily win with 88.6% of the vote. Interestingly, Kinnock won 99.2% from the affiliated unions, seen as a bedrock of leftist support in the past. The far left wouldn't recapture the party leadership again until Jeremy Corbyn's 2015 leadership victory. 2 days after the 1988 Labour Party conference, John Smith, who was the shadow chancellor under Neil Kinnock, suffered a heart attack on October 9, 1988. Normally, Brian Gould should have stood in for Smith, who was asked to take a few months' rest from Parliament because of his heart attack. Gould was Shadow Secretary of State for Trade and Industry. However, Gordon Brown, who was Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury and technically next in line within the Shadow Treasury hierarchy, convinced Kinnock that he would be able to stand in for Smith, as he was someone who had proven his competency in fiscal issues in the past. Kinnock accepted Brown as Smith's stand-in. A few weeks later, Brown gave Labor's response to the Conservatives' 1988 fall budget, in which he gave an impressive presentation to a standing ovation from his Labor colleagues. After Brown's speech, Peter Mandelson went to the press gallery of the House of Commons to gauge the reaction to Brown's speech. Mandelson would go on to tell them, quote, "A star was born," end of quote. As a result, Brown's profile increased, and he would go on to receive the most votes for the Labour Party shadow election in 1988. Now, before we continue, if you like this video so far, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you would like to support the channel, you can become a member by clicking the join button below. You can also become a member of my Patreon. And I want to thank all of my YouTube members and Patreons for helping to support the channel. Now, back to the video. In that same 1988 shadow cabinet election, the candidate that received the 9th most votes for the shadow government was Tony Blair from the constituency of Sedgefield, who would be appointed as shadow energy secretary by Neil Kinnock. As I mentioned earlier, both Brown and Blair worked in the same office in Parliament. As a result, the two talked about changing the Labour Party since they were first elected in 1983. Blair's political beginnings were different from that of Gordon Brown, who came up through the party ranks in Scotland. He went to Oxford to study law, graduating in 1975. After his graduation, he went on to join the Labour Party as a supporter of the Tribunist Left, a centre-right faction which saw Michael Foot's mainstream left as being too left and Tony Benn's left as being extreme. In 1982, he ran in a by-election in Beaconsfield, a safe Conservative seat west of London. He would go on to lose the election, losing more than 9% from Labour's previous result in the constituency. In all fairness, this was during the Falkland Islands War, with the British forces just having landed on Port St. Carlos. Still, Blair's first election would result in him losing his deposit. But even with this loss, he started to gain a profile, with the Glasgow Herald's William Russell saying that he was a, quote, very good candidate, despite the fact that Labour had no chance of winning the election. With the 1983 election coming, and with the Labour Party continuing to lay in ideological turmoil and division, Blair was approached to stand in Beaconsfield yet again. And while first considering it, he decided against running again in Beaconsfield because he knew that he would lose. He wanted to go to a place where he could win. Shopping for seats wasn't the easiest. In order for him to run, he would need to be selected by the constituency Labour Council. Most of those council nominations were dominated by factions. If you wanted to be nominated as a candidate for a constituency, then you would need to have the backing of a well-established constituency group. And because the constituency boundaries had been redrawn, some sitting MPs would have to find new constituencies. One of those was Les Huckfield, who was closely associated with Tony Benn, being a founding member of the Socialist Campaign Group in 1982. Huckfield decided that he wanted to run in Sedgefield, one of the newly created constituencies, since his old constituency was now a safe Tory seat. Tony Blair also had his eye on Sedgefield. Blair would approach John Burton, the branch secretary of the group, to ask to be their candidate for the constituency. With winning over other group members, he was selected as the Labour Party candidate for Sedgefield. These interpersonal skills would be something that would benefit him throughout his political career. Blair would go on to win the 1983 election, despite the fact that the Labour Party had gone left-wing, even if not totally Tony Benn left-wing. Blair had to campaign on the ideas of Michael Foot, as he was the party leader, but personally espoused views that was different from what Foot had been advocating for. Once Neil Kinnock took over the party, Blair was put into the position of Assistant Treasury Spokesman under Roy Hattersley in 1984, and would eventually ascend into a leadership role in 1987. Besides having different pathways leading them to the same office that they now shared, both Brown and Blair saw politics differently. Both agreed with Neil Kinnock that the party needed to focus more on winning elections. However, as to how elections should be won, both men had different approaches. For Gordon Brown, he supported the idea of having a strong policy while being on the attack against conservatives. The policies that he supported would not be too far left, like what Tony Benn supported, but neither too far right. Instead, he would take a pragmatic left approach, seeing good policy as leading to good election results, which would both lead to good governance. As for Tony Blair, he was more about winning elections above anything else. One could make the argument that Blair was only in the Labour Party tribunist faction because he thought that it would have the best chance of winning elections. But still, he wasn't as focused on policy as he was more focused on the image of the party. That image not only had to be improved by implementing the concept of the median voter theorem, the idea that a political party shifts to where the median voter lies, but a media and physical makeover, which meant younger candidates, fresh faces running things, and being much more media savvy. Going into the next election, things were looking good for Labour. During the 1989 European elections, Labour gained 3.9% on their last result, winning 45 seats to the European Parliament, compared to the Conservatives' 32 seats. In the Mid-Stratfordshire by-election, Labour gained 24.4% on their 1987 total, winning the previously safe Tory seat by defeating Charles Pryor 49% to 32%. In the 1990 local elections, Labour increased the number of councillors by 284 and winning 44% of all votes cast, compared to only 33% for Tory candidates. Electoral victories were just starting to fall in Labour's lap. On top of that, a poll done after the by-election by Gallup showed Labour with a 24.5% edge over the Tories, with Labour projected to win 52.5% of the popular vote compared to the Conservatives' 28% of the vote. But a lot of Labour's optimism came from turmoil within the Tories. There are two areas that saw the most contention: the poll tax and the future of Britain in Europe. First, let's start with the poll tax. Now, I want to explain that this tax is simply a community tax, a tax which people paid to their local community to provide funding for local services and infrastructure. It is not the same as we know it in the United States as a hurdle to voting for black voters. So just remember there's a difference. Local community councils were struggling when it came to funding, with many of them being accused of spending money recklessly. In many cases, this was true, but not in other cases. A lot of these accusations were towards councils that were labor controlled. Still, the Thatcher government decided to change the way in which people were taxed locally. The system had basically been similar to property tax here in the United States, where places with higher property values would pay higher taxes, but Thatcher's government decided to change it to a flat tax per person rate. This caused a number of problems, especially for those who changed residencies quite often, which wasn't uncommon. If someone lived in one town and the tax was levied on them, but then moved to another town, were they still responsible for that tax? While this did cause a headache, the bigger problem was the rates. First, it was assumed that the rates would be under £100 per year. That estimate eventually went up to £200, then £300, then £400. Eventually, this was seen as not just a tax break for landowners, especially those with higher valued properties, but an increased burden on those who were working class and poor, especially when the average salary in the UK was under £11,000 a year at that time. With that, the tax became highly unpopular with middle class voters, the bedrock of conservative support turning against them. When the tax was in full force, over 70% of those throughout the nation opposed the tax. Additionally, in some places, nearly 50% of those who had a poll tax levied on them did not pay the tax. As a result, the community councils were actually losing more money than in the previous system, causing communities to borrow money from banks to make up for shortfalls in their budgets. Things came to a head when, on March 31st, 1990, riots broke out throughout the United Kingdom, with the largest happening in London's Trafalgar Square. This protest turned violent, with protesters destroying property and lighting fires, while the police used heavy-handed tactics to stop destructive protesters. All political sides, including many militant, condemned the protest as done by anarchists. However, the conservatives overplayed their hand by making this look simply like a protest by the loony left. They insisted that it was only the left against the poll tax and that most of Britain were still silently for it. Things only got worse for Thatcher when Conservative MP Michael Heseltine wrote an article which appeared in the Times on May 10, 1990, saying that Thatcher would do nothing to change the poll tax. Many saw this as a direct attack on party leadership, positioning Heseltine as a possible candidate to run against Thatcher for party leader at the upcoming party conference. The other problem that Thatcher had was Europe. Many within the Tories were pro-European, while the Labour Party, for the most part, had been against the UK being part of the European community, soon to be called the European Union. But the tables had been turning. Since Kinnock's takeover of the party, Labour had become significantly more pro-European, with the likes of John Smith, Gordon Brown, and Tony Blair backing him up. As for Thatcher, she had always been lukewarm to Britain's entry into any European arrangement, especially since many in her party were strongly for such entry. She had issued warnings about what could happen to Britain if it entered into any European federation, worrying about the surrender of British sovereignty. While not even nearly at the level of Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage years later, many would argue that Thatcher was indeed anti-European. In addition, she was strongly opposed to a united Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. This, too, put her at odds with not just many within her party, but other world leaders who had sought for the reunification of Germany. Thatcher's image as being unbending, uncompromising, and quite authoritarian, which benefited her during the Falkland Islands War, had now turned totally against her, with people wanting a change, with many of her backbenchers, as well as her ministers, openly opposing the Prime Minister. In fact, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Nigel Lawson, resigned from his position as he continued to oppose Thatcher on economic policy, particularly the poll tax. Deputy Prime Minister Geoffrey Howe also resigned, citing Europe and fiscal policy as the reasons. In fact, in his speech to the House of Commons, Howe commented that perhaps he had stuck with the Prime Minister for too long. This was an indication that negative feelings against Thatcher were not novel, but had been stirring for some time. These resignations triggered a leadership challenge by Michael Heseltine, who had already expressed his discontent with Thatcher with his article in the Times back in May. Going into the Conservative leadership race battle on November 20th, Thatcher was expected to get the most votes, with the votes being cast by Conservative MPs. But would she get enough to avoid a second ballot? Many in the media assumed that if the leadership race went to a second ballot, Thatcher was done for. In the first round, Thatcher won 54.8% of the vote, but because the rules stated that the winner had to have a 15% lead over second place, she was not elected on the first ballot. This was the nail in the coffin for Margaret Thatcher. 2 days later, on November 22nd, Thatcher announced that she was resigning as Prime Minister. John Major, the Chancellor of the Exchequer now, would go on to win the Conservative Party leadership, thus becoming the next Prime Minister. For Neil Kinnock and Labour, they really wanted to run against Margaret Thatcher. She was unpopular and the economy was starting to show signs of struggle. Kinnock demanded that an election should be called for a new government as soon as possible. After all, his party was up by over 20% in all the polls that had been conducted. But neither Thatcher nor Major would call an election, with the next election taking place on April 9th, 1992. This was a problem for Labour. Up until that time, Labour had been arguing that Thatcher had been Prime Minister for too long and that it was time for a change. However, with John Major now the Prime Minister, that change had come. Voters were allowed to vote Conservative without it being attached to Thatcherism. It was Neil Kinnock who no longer looked like the change candidate. On top of that, Labour came across as arrogant, assuming that they had already won the election. Their rally in Sheffield, while actually pretty good, looked more like a well-produced victory speech than a campaign rally. All the polls narrowed, and both Kinnock and Gordon Brown would say years later that they knew they were going to lose the election 2 or 3 days before Election Day. However, many thought that it would be a hung parliament, with John Major in a minority government. But in the end of the day, though the Conservatives lost 40 seats, they would win 336 seats, 10 more than the required 326 for a majority. While Labour's vote improved by 3.6% from last time, they gained 42 seats, which wasn't enough. The media, particularly The Sun, continuously slammed Kinnock and Labour throughout the election, but that's outside the scope of this video and maybe a video for the future. 4 days after the election, Neil Kinnock resigned as party leader. John Smith, who was the shadow chancellor of the Exchequer, was considered the favorite to be the next leader of the Labour Party. While Smith was someone who shifted the party further right, some thought that he would take a slow approach to modernizing the party. Both Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair encouraged Gordon Brown to run against Smith for the leadership, but Brown refused. Since both men were from Scotland and had worked together for decades under the Scottish Labour Party, Brown wouldn't challenge someone who he considered a friend. Blair didn't run as his profile was still not as high as Brown's profile, and Mandelson, though well known, had just been elected to Hartlepool a few days earlier. Therefore, Smith was elected over token opposition from Brian Gould. Once Smith took over the job, it became immediately apparent to Mandelson, Blair, and Brown that modernization of the party was going to be very slow, especially when, according to Mandelson, Smith thought that the problem was more to do with having a new leader than to actually change the policy and image of the Labour Party. However, Tony Blair also started viewing Brown as someone who wasn't up for the challenge, since he balked at the chance at taking on Smith for the leadership. Simply put, if the modernization in Labour were to rely on Gordon Brown to be their savior, then they might be waiting for a long time. It's at this point when Tony Blair realized that he needed to step up his profile, not waiting for Brown, and start considering a future run at the leadership himself. But it wasn't just Blair who saw himself as a potential leader. After Smith was elected, the Sunday Times magazine had Blair on their cover with the title, "The Leader Labor Missed." Still, Blair, Brown, and Mandelson pushed on. Brown was now to be the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, with Blair being Shadow Home Secretary. With that, Brown had power to shift Labor's economic policy, moving towards having a centrist view of the economy and opposing tax and spend policies that Labor had supported for decades. Therefore, as mentioned earlier, Brown thought that modernizing the party was through de-radicalizing policy, which now he was in a position to do. As for Blair, he was different. Yes, he had a high-profile position in the shadow cabinet of John Smith, but he still thought that the way for Labor to win over control of government was by a total image rebranding, which didn't just include policy, but public relations as well. Most of Blair's time was spent making appearances throughout the country, talking to people, and making himself known. But on top of that, Blair was rocking the boat. Both he and Gordon Brown went to the United States to speak to Bill Clinton and to understand the success of the Clinton campaign in the 1992 presidential election. While Brown didn't say much, Blair made it abundantly clear that the Labor Party had to learn from the new Democratic movement in the United States. One of those issues that Blair would speak out on, much in the way that Bill Clinton had done, was to be tough on crime. This eventually caused a rift in the party, with many, including Labor leader John Smith, saying that Blair was rushing too quickly into modernization. Other members were accusing him of trying to ideologically change Labor, as many saw Clinton's Democrats as simply being another form of British Toryism. Still, it was at this point that New Labor was born.
Madam Speaker, when I heard the tragic news of John Smith this morning, I thought it right that this House should meet this afternoon to pay tribute to a distinguished parliamentarian and then adjourn. I frankly do not believe there would have been the stomach for any other business in this House today. Madam Speaker, I know the whole House would wish me first to express my deep and warm sympathy for Mrs. Smith and for John Smith's family, his wife and his daughters. In this House, we've lost a formidable senior member of very rare ability. To the Labour Party also, I offer my deep sympathy after some serious hammer blows that they have faced amongst their colleagues in recent months.
Madam Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister and those others who've spoken for what they have said about John Smith. I had the privilege of knowing him and working with him very closely over 25 years in Parliament and in government. And he had two qualities which I would like to refer to. Inside him burned the flame of anger against injustice and the flame of hope that we could build a better world. And that was what moved him. And secondly, he was a man who always said the same wherever he was. If you heard him in public at a meeting, if you heard him in private, if you heard him in the cabinet, if you heard him in the House of Commons, he always said the same thing. And for that reason, he was trusted. He was a lovely man. And I hope that his family will gain something from the knowledge that their grief is shared by us.
Mr. Neil Kinnock.
Madam Speaker, can I first of all thank the Prime Minister for making the decision about today's business so that the House can signify the great sense of bereavement that I know will be felt in all quarters. Madam Speaker, all of us know the numbness and emptiness which seizes us when we hear of the death of a loved one or a dear friend. No matter what the time or the circumstances of death, the feeling of shock overwhelms all other senses. This morning, I was grieving over the death of my beloved mother-in-law, who died very suddenly last night when I heard the dreadful news that John was dead. I have to say, Madam Speaker, that I was desolated. Across the movement that he led with distinction for all too short a time, and in this House and in the country, John Smith will be mourned. The nation knows that his consummate abilities and his fierce sense of social justice all carried a force of integrity and talent that is precious and much needed at all times and in all nations.
With the death of John Smith, another leadership vacuum opened up in the Labour Party. Of course, the two frontrunners for the position were Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Immediately after John Smith's death, the two men took different approaches. As for Brown, he was thinking about how he was going to mourn the loss of his friend, such as writing a eulogy for his funeral. As for Blair, who was in Aberdeen, Scotland when the news of Smith's death was known, flew immediately back to London at the suggestion of Peter Mandelson. Brown never assumed that Blair would run for party leadership, assuming that Robin Cook or John Prescott were the most likely opponents and that he would defeat both of them easily. Brown also assumed that Blair would simply support his leadership candidacy. But remember what I said earlier, that Tony Blair had been wondering if Gordon Brown was up to the challenge of being leader after refusing to challenge John Smith. Well, those thoughts were coming back, and Blair started to consolidate support for his own leadership run, which he had yet to announce. On the day of Smith's death, there had already been rumors of Blair being the possible successor to Smith. The man that Gordon Brown assumed would simply back his candidacy for the leadership might now actually be a candidate against him. Furthermore, with each passing day, the support behind Blair, both in the media and amongst members within the Labour camp, were moving in his direction. In a television interview, Alistair Campbell, at that time the political editor of the show Today, said unequivocally that Tony Blair should be the next leader of the Labour Party. Essentially, Blair had all of his ducks in a row and was gathering as much support as possible as quickly as possible, while Gordon Brown was simply contemplating whether he would enter the race or not. The momentum had gone so strongly in Blair's favor that even if Brown entered the race, it was probably a losing endeavor. This became even more likely when Peter Mandelson, who had stayed neutral in the early days of the leadership race, decided to throw support behind Blair. Knowing that this would be the case, and not wanting to hurt the friendship that Blair had with Brown, the two would meet at a restaurant called Grenada to come to a gentleman's agreement, that if Blair was elected Prime Minister, that he would only seat 2 terms. He would also make Brown Chancellor as well as in charge of social policy. Years later, there would be questions as to what was actually agreed, since only Blair and Brown knew the real contents of that discussion. However, Brown's friendship with Peter Mandelson would be severed for years, until Brown asked Mandelson to help him when Brown eventually became Prime Minister. Gordon Brown eventually announced that he would not seek the leadership of the Labour Party, with John Prescott and Margaret Beckett being the only opposition to Tony Blair. Blair would go on to win the Labour Party leadership race with 57% of the overall vote. With the party shifting to the center on economic policy, something Gordon Brown had been doing over the last few years since being elected Shadow Chancellor, and Tony Blair as the new, young, fresh face of the party, with many comparisons to Bill Clinton, how did Labour improve between Blair's election as party leader and the general election in 1997, in which the Labour Party dominated? Well, they really didn't do anything except continuing to carry on the way they had been. They really didn't have any major changes to the party since John Smith took over, with the exception of Tony Blair now asking the Prime Minister questions instead of John Smith. Yes, Tony Blair was more media savvy, but that really didn't matter. So, did Tony Blair actually save Labour? To me, the answer is no. While Tony Blair did become Prime Minister in 1997, he was part of a Labour organization which included both Peter Mandelson and Gordon Brown. But I think that many people, particularly here in the United States, saw Tony Blair myopically as the single reason for Labour's turnaround. The better question to ask is whether Gordon Brown or John Smith would have won, and by the margin that Blair won by. Well, let's look at some of the facts. Immediately after the 1992 election, there were a number of scandals that plagued the Conservative Party. Seriously, there's like an entire Wikipedia page of scandals that they were actually broken down by year. But on top of that, the economy was continuing to decline or was stagnant. As far as the issue of Europe, it was now the Conservatives who had the party and policy rifts, while Labour finally had some policy cohesion. Most Labour MPs supported Britain entering what was now called the European Union, with Tories split down the middle between pro-European factions and the Eurosceptics. Unlike 1983, when the Tories looked stable and Labour was in disarray, it was now the opposite way around, with Labour looking more like the responsible party to lead the British government into the 21st century. But back to the main question, was Blair the reason the party was saved? Again, I say no. The Labour Party was in the lead of every single public opinion poll from January 11th, 1993 until the election on May 1st, 1997, which spanned over 4 years. When John Smith died on May 12th, 1994, Labour had anywhere between a 13% and 25% lead over the Tories. A poll conducted 2 days after Smith had died by ICM Guardian, which was the last poll to ever give the Tories the lead back in January of 1993, gave Labour a 17% lead. Yes, when Blair became leader, those numbers jumped to between 12% and an astounding 33%, but 25%, 33%, like, who's counting? The point is that Labour were always poised to likely be the next government, and whether it was Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or even John Smith, it's highly likely that any one of them would have been elected prime minister. The point here is that Blair shouldn't be seen as the knight in shining armor that saved Labour. It was a team effort that greatly benefited from the collapse of the Conservatives. And with that, we have come to the end of the video. If you would like to see another video about a centrist who came from nowhere to become the leader of one of the most powerful countries in Europe, check out the video about Macron right here. Again, thank you for watching the video. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, my link for Patreon is down below, and you can press the join button to become a member of this channel. Again, thank you, and I will see you all in the next video.